Appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending. My goal is to provide you significant value today, and I hope I can do that. I've always felt blessed that my family owns the land that I grew up next to. And I've done a lot of work to keep this land in my family. In August of 2019, my family received a letter from a solar developer that was relatively new to the New York market. And this developer, the letter basically stated that they believed we had a viable solar project, and that they could use up at least 60% of our land and give us payments in the order of $1,500 to $2,000 per acre per year. And within 6 to 8 weeks, we had similar letters and calls from approximately 10 developers. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about my family, a little bit about my land. My great-grandparents bought the land in 46. They were immigrants from Poland, and it's in the town of Guilderland, has approximately 130 acres. As Dayton mentioned, we were dairy farmers. They made a modest living selling milk. When my great-grandfather passed, he ended up, or she, my great-grandmother, sold the farm to her two sons, my grandfather being one of them. And shortly after that, my grandfather's brother got into a fatal car crash. And so my grandfather ended up with, having a heavy heart, one less worker, and twice the mortgage payment. So my dad, growing up, had to help his father a lot. And if you're in a farming community, I'm sure this is something you feel, the kids try to help the parents, and I'm doing the same with my dad today. So when my grandfather learned that he was going to have a grandson, being me, he gave a corner acre of the plot far from where he was living to my dad to build on. And I spent most of my childhood just playing outside on the land. I spent a lot of time in the barn at milking time, and a lot of time helping my dad split wood, because we heated primarily with wood. And when I was a little kid, I remember just seeing my dad and my grandfather just using these chainsaws to break down these fallen trees, and then to split them up for wood. And I wanted to help at a young age. And apparently I asked for a chainsaw over and over and over again. I think I was 1.5 years to 2. And so finally on my 3rd birthday, my grandfather bought me this little chainsaw. But the reason why I'm telling you all this is because I feel really blessed to have my family and this property. And so when we were approached by developers and my dad asked for help in evaluating our options, I really took it to heart and wanted to make the best decision for my family. And I wanted to honor my family, the land, and our neighbors, because all of those people appreciate our land as well. So I wanted to make a decision that really protected our land, our family, our neighbors. And so in my mind, the culprits of effective decision-making are 2 things, and that's anger and fear. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was working with my family to just calm them down, reduce their fear, and help them figure out the result that they really wanted. My dad asked me to help them out because I studied renewable energy in college. It was kind of a no-brainer for me. I went to school at James Madison, and I was strong in math and science, and I love nature, especially pristine nature. So I got a job out of school consulting to the development of wind and solar projects. And after some time, I started my own company named Sustainable Energy Developments. That was in 2002. And we developed decentralized community wind projects where we would take a large-scale turbine or a medium-scale wind turbine and power a facility directly. So we developed and constructed these projects, and you may be familiar with some. one most notably being the Jiminy Peak Ski Resort, just on the other side of the New York-Mass border in the Berkshires. And so eventually I sold my stake in the company, and my parents wanted me to sit down with the developers because of my background and experience. And so I sat down with my parents and we put together a long list of questions that we wanted to ask to evaluate this opportunity in the market, and all sorts of questions like, how are these people going to gain all the necessary permits? If there is dissent or anger amongst community members, how are they going to handle that? My parents liked the numbers that were being presented, but were a little skeptical and apprehensive because they just had so much information coming at them. And I think all the calls got to be a little bit overwhelming. So I decided to be the main contact for my family and to kind of lead group discussions and be the point of contact where if we had follow-up questions, the developers could talk to me directly. Most of the developers were really quite likable. Some of the others seemed a bit rushed and didn't necessarily, in my perception, have our best interests in mind. But overall, they were pretty open-minded, and it was a big give and take, a big process of communication where we were identifying each other's needs. And so some developers gave us the space to process their offers and the situation, which my family really appreciated, while others communicated in a capacity like they were trying to really create a sense of urgency. We would hear stories from developers about how they were working on projects where they entered into a contract with a landowner only to learn later that a different project on the same circuit was ahead of them in the interconnection queue, meaning that the project was undevelopable and that they probably lost that window in a matter of a couple of weeks. So it was relatively easy for me to figure out there were no other large enough land plots that were suitable for solar on the circuit that we were going to interconnect to, meaning that we had the privilege of moving at our own pace, which really lowered the anxiety levels. So then our job was to determine if we wanted solar on the property, if that made sense, and if so, where the panels would go, and really think about all the things that could go wrong that we wanted to protect ourselves from. And ultimately, which developer would meet our needs. So it was really obvious to me that there are a lot of benefits of solar, especially working in the renewable energy industry. It's a time-tested technology, and there are lots of projects in New York, and we actually had two operating projects and currently have two operating projects in the town that I grew up in. So we had the ability to learn from those projects, and we went to the landowners and kind of picked their brain and asked them about their process and outcome, and they seemed very happy with both. We also like the concept that it creates revenue for the town without the expense of extra people in the community or putting children in schools. And obviously it helps improve air, water, soil quality, and reduces carbon emissions while producing clean energy to the community. So after acquiring a little bit of information, it was kind of a no-brainer to say yes to solar. And it was more a matter of, okay, where is this going to go, and what's the best way to develop this project? And what developer or developers really will meet and address our needs. So there was at the time, there was a highly controversial project being developed on the western side of Guilderland in the escarpment that's highly visible and highly valued for its aesthetics. And there were a couple thousand people petitioning this project. And so we knew that visibility would be a real concern among community members, and our land is set up such that there's a a higher property and a lower property. And the lower property, or the lower plane, there's a road that goes around, and that's where all the houses are. And on the higher plane, the land that abuts our property line is owned by the town, and it's open space. It's a golf course. So we have the wonderful and unique capacity to place the project on the upper portion of our land where community members cannot see it, where homes and residents can't see it. And so we knew we wanted to kind of limit the visibility, even if it meant that we were going to have a smaller sum of income received. So we decided to go with solar. We decided our location, and then we started going through the details of, what these developers were proposing. And Scott's probably going to be able to talk about this in much more eloquent and articulate detail than I will be able to. But every offer was different, and so it took a little while to compare apples to apples. Some of the payments and leases were structured on a $1 per acre basis. Others were on a $1 per installed power unit basis. Some had extra cash payments at time of operation. Some had escalators. All the escalators were different. Some didn't have escalators. So it took a little while to kind of compare those apples to apples. And then there's also the issues of competency. Like, will this developer really be able to develop this project? Because these lease payments mean nothing if the project doesn't get built. So we really started to kind of probe into their business models and asked a lot of questions. We knew that angry community members could derail a project. I've seen that happen multiple times before. And I asked a lot of questions about how the developers would communicate with concerned community members and what their strategy was to really gain acceptance for a project like this. And we also wanted to ensure that there was a path, at least an option, to permit a project without having to rezone our property. Right now, we're zoned in a capacity where we have 1 acre subdivisions, and in order to be able to install a project, we need to reclassify to a 3 acre subdivision. And so there were 2 developers who I really respect, who are willing to make our arrangement contingent upon finding a way not to have to rezone. Another thing that we wanted to ensure was that our land would be completely restored after the project was done producing electricity, whether this would happen at the decommissioning of the project, at the end of its useful life, or due to some sort of financial problem of the future owner and insolvency of the project. So, or for some other reason which we couldn't really think about or couldn't understand at the time. So some of the lease agreements that we received cleaned up from a certain level below the ground and up, and would not go beyond 2, 3, 4 feet. And we knew there would be equipment down there. So as farmers or someone who wanted to work the land, we knew that would be a major issue. We also wanted to protect ourselves from the financial troubles where an owner of a project would have some sort of insolvency issue and not be able to pay for the decommissioning. So some of the developers were willing to put into the lease agreement or the LOI the purchase of a surety bond, which is also known as a decommissioning bond, which basically allows funds to decommission the project. Thankfully, this is a moot point now because the town requires the purchase of a decommissioning bond prior to the issuance of a special use permit. And so we went through this whole process, and after many conversations with my folks, it became obvious that I could protect my family's best interests and the interest of the land better than anyone else. So I created a company, an entity named Ecolegacy Values, to basically hold the project assets. And I'll tell you more about the project assets in a little bit. So I've been developing them into a financeable state while creating a plan to expand. I simply thought it would be easier to cultivate community support and develop the project more effectively with my background than with a traditional developer, mainly because I worked on permitting projects that were really highly visible in the wind realm. So this was a decision that was made a little bit more than a year after we were first approached by developers. So I've been talking about the project up until now from the perspective of a landowner and a family member, where we would be leasing our land. But now I'm going to kind of shift and talk about what makes a good project in the eyes of most developers and ultimately in the eyes of financiers. But to do that, let me just differentiate between a utility scale project and a community distributed generation project, which people call CDG projects. I will call them community projects. I think acronyms can be very confusing to people, at least if they've never heard of them before. So the power that's generated from a utility scale project is interconnected to utility scale lines, high voltage transmission lines. These are the lines that you see that are a couple hundred feet above the ground, typically near major interstates. They're very large transmission lines, whereas a community project is interconnected to a lower level distribution voltage line, a lower level voltage line. So the CDG projects are basically connected to the lines that feed your homes. And they need to be, and CDG projects take tens of acres, where utility scale projects can take up to hundreds or thousands of acres. So a typical size for a community project are in the 5 to megawatt range, and these terms are in alternating current terms and AC terms. The power that's generated at the panel is in DC terms, direct current terms. The power is cleaned up and there's an efficiency loss before it turns into AC. And it's important to understand that, especially when looking at contracts and talking about these details. So my family's project is approximately 8 megawatts AC, and it will take up to 40 to 50 acres, depending on the engineering. Because of electrical requirements, these projects need to be interconnected to a 3-phase distribution line. So the lines that feed your homes are either single phase, double phase, or triple or 3-phase, 1, 2, or 3. And the way you know is how many lines are on the top of the pole. So a 3-phase line has 3 lines on the top of the pole. And it's approximately $100 a foot to run 3-phase line, which means a mile run is about $500,000 to run a line. And this cost gets put on the cost of the project and is determined by the utility company when you go to the utility company to work through the process of gaining an interconnection agreement. So there are also additional costs, upgrade costs that the utility company will put on the project. But obviously, the smaller those costs are, the more competitive the project is, and the more likely it will be to receive financing. Our family's project is approximately 1,200 feet from Route 20, which has a 3-phase line on it. And it's on a circuit that's incentivized to receive power, which is why we had so many developers approaching us. It's just a good project. So you need to have, in order to make a financeable project, you need to have land relatively close to an electric line that has the capacity to handle more power. That's the big one. There also needs to be a path to acquire permits. Ideally, the town will have laws in place to permit a project, but that's not always the case. And sometimes they're not favorable. But if they do have laws on the books, that's typically a good thing. And if there are existing projects in the town, that's even better because it sets precedents for both the town and the developer and the landowners. Also, on paper, the project needs to be considered financeable, meaning the revenues have to be considerably more than the cost of the project. So put another way, developers are gaining project assets and they're de-risking these project assets to the state where they're financeable. And the project assets are an agreement with a landowner, an interconnection agreement with a utility company, permits with the town, and incentives secured by NYSERDA. I think the most important thing to take out of all this is if you have land relatively close to three-phase power and would like to consider solar, then I urge you to find a developer that you like and are comfortable with. You may have the ability to harvest millions of dollars from your land. If you would like to speak about your options, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is on my website, which is www.ecolegacyvalues, all one word, ECOLEGACY values, VALUES.com. And my phone number is area code 518-366-5708. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you the best of luck in your pursuits.